In the vast expanse of the Soviet Union during the 1980s, a nightmare was unfolding in the shadows of train stations and forest paths. But in a nation that officially claimed such horrors could not exist within its borders, a predator moved freely, claiming victim after victim while the system itself became an accomplice to his crimes. This is the story of Andrei Chikatilo, the man who would become known as the Red Ripper, the Butcher of Rostov, and one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. Between 1978 and 1990, he murdered at least 52 people, though the true number may never be known. His victims were children, teenagers, and young women, vulnerable souls who vanished from bus stops and railway platforms across the southwestern Soviet Union. But this isn't just a story about one man's descent into depravity. It's a chilling examination of how ideology, bureaucratic dysfunction, and willful blindness allowed a monster to hunt unimpeded for over a decade. In a society that insisted such evil could only exist in the decadent West, Chikatilo's existence was a truth too uncomfortable to acknowledge, until the mounting body count made denial impossible. The Soviet state, with its vast surveillance apparatus and rigid control, should have caught him quickly. Instead, systemic failures, investigative incompetence, and an unwillingness to admit the truth turned what could have been a brief investigation into a 12-year reign of terror. Innocent men were executed for his crimes. Evidence was mishandled. And all the while, Chikatilo continued his grotesque work, hiding in plain sight as a respectable Communist Party member, a teacher, and a family man. This is the story of how a nation's denial cost dozens of lives, and how one of history's most disturbing serial killers was finally brought to justice. Welcome to the true story of the Red Ripper. Thank you for your love and support. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. To understand the monster Andrei Chikatilo became, we must journey back to October 16, 1936, when he was born in the village of Yabloknoy in Ukraine. But even before his birth, tragedy had marked his family. Chikatilo's mother told him repeatedly throughout his childhood about an older brother, Stepan, who had allegedly been kidnapped and cannibalized by starving neighbors during the devastating Holodomor famine of the 1930s. Whether this story was true or not, and historians have found no evidence Stepan ever existed, it haunted Chikatilo throughout his life. The tale of cannibalism during desperate times became lodged in his psyche, a dark seed that would later manifest in unspeakable ways. Chikatilo's childhood was marked by privation, humiliation, and fear. Born nearsighted in an era when glasses were scarce, he struggled in school and was mercilessly bullied. He was a bedwetter well into his teens, a source of profound shame as his mother would beat him and publicly humiliate him for soiling the single bed they shared in their one-room hut. There was no privacy, no escape from the ridicule. World War II brought fresh horrors. His father was captured by the Germans and later returned home, only to be branded a coward and traitor for having surrendered. The stigma followed the entire family. Young Andrei learned to associate shame with every aspect of existence: his poverty, his poor eyesight, his bedwetting, his father's alleged cowardice. As he entered adolescence, Chikatilo discovered another source of deep shame: sexual dysfunction. His first attempt at intercourse, as a teenager, ended in humiliating failure and premature ejaculation. The girl mocked him, and word spread. This pattern would repeat throughout his life. Chikatilo found he could only achieve sexual arousal and satisfaction through violence, domination, and eventually murder. Despite these struggles, Chikatilo desperately wanted to appear normal. He married a woman his sister introduced him to, and together they had 2 children. He joined the Communist Party, became a teacher, and wore the mask of respectability. But beneath the surface, darkness was growing. His career as a teacher was troubled from the start. There were complaints, whispered accusations that he behaved inappropriately with students, lingering too long with young children, making them uncomfortable. He was forced to move from school to school, each transfer quietly arranged, each complaint swept under the rug to avoid scandal. By the late 1970s, Chikatilo was a man at war with himself. A facade of Soviet respectability barely containing a seething mass of rage, shame, and violent sexual compulsion. The mask was beginning to slip. And in December 1978, it would finally fall away completely, revealing the monster beneath. December 22, 1978. 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova left school in the town of Shakhty and began walking home. She never arrived. Her body was found 3 days later by a river, bearing evidence of a frenzied sadistic attack. She had been strangled, stabbed, and sexually assaulted. The brutality shocked even hardened investigators. For Andrei Chikatilo, this was a moment of terrible revelation. In the act of murdering Lena Zakotnova, he discovered something that both horrified and thrilled him. He could only achieve sexual climax through violence and death. The murder, the blood, the complete domination of another human being, this was what his damaged psyche required. And with that first kill, a pattern was set that would repeat dozens of times over the next 12 years. But remarkably, Chikatilo nearly didn't get away with it. Witnesses had seen him with the girl. A neighbor reported seeing him near his shabby shack on the day of the murder with bloodstains on his face. The police questioned him. But Chikatilo had something working in his favor. He was a Communist Party member, a respectable family man with a teaching position. Surely such a person couldn't commit such an atrocity. The investigators instead focused on a previously convicted rapist named Alexander Kravchenko, who lived near where the body was found. Despite a lack of concrete evidence, the pressure to solve the case was immense. Kravchenko was tortured until he confessed. He was executed in 1983 for a crime he didn't commit, while the real killer walked free. For Chikatilo, the successful evasion of justice for his first murder was intoxicating. He had killed and gotten away with it. But he also recognized the danger of killing close to home. His next murders would be more carefully planned, more strategic. He would hunt far from his residence, targeting victims who wouldn't be immediately missed. 3 years passed before he killed again. On September 3, 1981, 17-year-old Larissa Tkachenko was waiting at a bus stop in Rostov when Chikatilo approached her. He lured her into nearby woods with promises of alcohol and food. There, he attacked her with savage fury, stabbing her repeatedly and mutilating her body. He had found his method, his hunting ground, and his preferred victims. Over the following months and years, the pattern solidified. Chikatilo would cruise railway stations and bus stops, transient places where vulnerable people gathered. His targets were usually children and young women, often runaways, orphans, or those from troubled homes. People society had marginalized, people whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or investigated with urgency. He became expert at gaining trust. To children, he appeared as a grandfatherly figure, offering candy or assistance. To young women, he might pose as someone official or someone who could help them find work. Once isolated in a forest or secluded area, he would attack with shocking speed and violence. The murders were not quick or merciful. Chikatilo would stab his victims repeatedly, often dozens of times, mutilating their bodies in increasingly grotesque ways. He targeted sexual organs, eyes, and faces. In some cases, he engaged in acts of cannibalism, literally biting off and consuming body parts. For Chikatilo, each murder was a sexual act. The violence itself was how he achieved arousal and release. By 1984, the body count was rising alarmingly. But in the Soviet system, these dots were not being connected. Each local police jurisdiction handled its own cases, and there was little sharing of information between regions. The victims came from different areas, and their bodies were found scattered across a vast territory. The Soviet Union's very size and bureaucratic structure were working in Chikatilo's favor. By 1983, the accumulation of similar murders across the Rostov region could no longer be ignored. Bodies kept turning up near railway stations and in forests, victims of extreme violence, sexual assault, and mutilation. The patterns were too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Soviet authorities were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: they had a serial killer on their hands. This admission itself was remarkable. Serial murder was something Soviet propaganda associated with the moral decay of capitalist societies. America, with its crime and inequality, could produce such monsters, but not the Soviet Union. The official ideology held that their socialist system had eliminated the social conditions that created such deviancy. To admit a serial killer was operating in the USSR was to admit ideological failure. Nevertheless, the evidence was undeniable. In 1983, a special investigation team was formed under the leadership of Major Mikhail Fetisov. The team began the painstaking work of connecting cases across different jurisdictions, a process hampered by poor record-keeping, interdepartmental rivalry, and the sheer geographic scope of the crimes. As they compiled data, a profile emerged. The killer targeted vulnerable individuals near transit hubs. The victims showed similar patterns of injury, multiple stab wounds, mutilation, evidence of sexual violence. The killer appeared to be mobile, striking in different cities and towns across the region, always near railways or bus stations. But here the investigation ran into a wall that would delay justice for years: forensic science, and specifically blood typing. Soviet forensic techniques included testing bodily fluids found at crime scenes. Semen samples recovered from several victims showed a blood type AB. This was a crucial clue, or so investigators thought. Andrei Chikatilo was interviewed multiple times during the investigation. His work as a supply clerk required extensive travel by train, placing him in the right locations at the right times. His history of inappropriate behavior with children made him a person of interest. But each time he was questioned, he was eventually released. Why? His blood type was A. What investigators didn't know, what Soviet forensic science hadn't yet recognized, was that Chikatilo had a rare condition in which his blood type and his semen blood type were different. Approximately 20% of the population are non-secretors, meaning their bodily fluids don't reveal their blood type the same way their blood does. Chikatilo's blood was type A, but his semen showed markers that matched type AB. This discrepancy, which should have been explainable, instead created a false alibi that excluded him from suspicion time and time again. The investigation became a massive undertaking. At its peak, over 300 investigators were assigned to the case. They conducted over 150,000 interviews. They took blood samples from thousands of men in the region. Undercover officers were stationed at railway platforms and bus stops. Yet Chikatilo remained free, continuing his deadly work. Part of the problem was the sheer volume of suspects. The investigation cast such a wide net that valuable leads were buried under mountains of data. Without modern computer databases, everything was tracked by hand: index cards, paper files, manual cross-referencing. Critical connections were missed in the avalanche of information. Moreover, Soviet investigative culture was hampered by its own methods. There was enormous pressure to solve cases quickly, leading to rushed conclusions and false arrests. Police could be brutal in their interrogations, sometimes extracting false confessions through torture. Several men were arrested, held, and convicted of individual murders that were actually Chikatilo's work. The most tragic was Alexander Kravchenko, executed for the first murder in 1978. Meanwhile, Chikatilo was growing bolder. He killed 8 people in 1984 alone. The frequency of attacks was increasing. And despite the massive police presence, he seemed to slip through their fingers every time. He was questioned, released, questioned again, released again. The blood type evidence kept saving him. By the mid-1980s, the investigation had become a source of frustration and embarrassment. How could such a monster continue to operate despite such intensive police work? The answer lay in a combination of factors: the vastness of the Soviet Union, bureaucratic dysfunction, investigative tunnel vision, and one crucial piece of misunderstood forensic evidence that repeatedly pointed investigators away from the real killer. While Andrei Chikatilo hunted his victims, he was aided by an unlikely accomplice: the Soviet system itself. The very structure of Soviet society, its ideology, its bureaucracy, its obsession with appearances, created an environment where a serial killer could thrive for over a decade. First, there was the ideological blindness. Soviet propaganda had long maintained that serial murder was a uniquely Western phenomenon, a product of capitalism's social decay. This wasn't just rhetoric, it shaped how crimes were classified and investigated. When bodies began piling up, there was institutional resistance to admitting they were connected. Each murder was initially treated as an isolated incident because the alternative, acknowledging a serial killer, was ideologically uncomfortable. This denial extended to public communication. As the murders continued through the 1980s, Soviet authorities refused to warn the public. There were no news reports, no public safety announcements, no warnings to children and young women to be cautious around strangers. To issue such warnings would be to admit the problem existed, and that would contradict the official narrative of Soviet society's safety and order. Parents in the affected regions had no idea their children were at risk. School officials weren't alerted. Social workers weren't warned. The very people who might have protected potential victims or provided crucial information were kept in the dark. This silence was deadly. Victim after victim fell into Chikatilo's trap, unaware that a predator was hunting in their midst. The bureaucratic structure of Soviet law enforcement further hampered the investigation. Police departments were organized by region and jealously guarded their jurisdictions. Information sharing was poor. When a body was found in one region, investigators there might not know about similar murders in neighboring areas. There was no centralized database, no nationwide coordination. Chikatilo exploited this fragmentation brilliantly, spreading his murders across a wide geographic area to avoid detection. Even when the special investigative team was formed, bureaucratic obstacles remained. Mikhail Fedosov and his team faced resistance from local police departments, many of whom resented outside interference. Some local investigators actively withheld information or failed to follow up on leads because they didn't want regional outsiders claiming credit for solving their cases. The investigation was also hampered by the quality of Soviet forensic science. While Soviet investigators were competent and dedicated, they lacked access to the advanced techniques being developed in the West. There was no DNA analysis. Computer databases didn't exist. The psychological profiling of serial killers, pioneered by the FBI in the United States during this same period, was unknown in the USSR. Moreover, Soviet investigators operated under intense political pressure. The Communist Party wanted results, and they wanted them quickly. This pressure led to shortcuts, false arrests, and wrongful convictions. It was easier to pin a murder on a convenient suspect, a vagrant, a previously convicted criminal, someone without political protection, than to admit the investigation was stalled. Chikatilo benefited immensely from his social position. He was a Communist Party member, a factor that gave him a veneer of respectability and made investigators hesitant to pursue him aggressively. In Soviet society, party membership was both a privilege and a shield. It signaled political reliability, social standing, moral character. The idea that a party member could be a sadistic serial killer was almost unthinkable. His job as a supply clerk also provided perfect cover. His work required constant travel by train throughout the region, exactly the pattern the killer's movement suggested. But because he had a legitimate reason to be in these locations, his presence never raised alarms. He could explain being in any town, near any railway station, at any time. His job was his alibi. There were close calls. In 1984, Chikatilo was arrested for suspicious behavior at a bus station in Rostov. Police observed him attempting to lure young women and found a knife and rope in his possession. But he was only charged with minor offenses and released after serving a brief sentence. The investigators working the serial killer case were never notified of his arrest because it was handled by a different department. This lack of communication potentially cost more lives. The most frustrating aspect of the Soviet system's role was how many times Chikatilo was actually questioned by investigators. By various estimates, he was interviewed at least 4 or 5 times during the investigation. Each time, he presented himself as a respectable party member, a family man, an ordinary Soviet citizen. And each time, that damning blood-type evidence, misunderstood and misinterpreted, seemed to clear him. As the 1980s wore on, the murders continued with horrifying regularity. Chikatilo's confidence grew with each successful evasion. He killed 8 people in 1984, 15 people in 1985. The investigation had become the largest manhunt in Soviet history, involving hundreds of investigators and costing millions of rubles. Yet the killer remained free, aided by the very system that was supposed to stop him. By the late 1980s, the Chikatilo investigation had become a massive operation consuming vast resources and achieving minimal results. The case had broken the careers of several investigators and had become a source of shame for Soviet law enforcement. But changes were coming, both in the Soviet Union itself and in the investigation that would finally lead to the killer's capture. In 1985, a crucial figure entered the case, Viktor Burakov, a forensic psychiatrist and investigator who brought new perspectives to the hunt. Unlike many of his colleagues, Burakov was willing to look beyond traditional Soviet investigative methods. He studied what little information was available about serial killers in the West. He began building a psychological profile of the unknown killer. Burakov recognized that the killer wasn't a stereotypical criminal. The murderer was likely educated, employed, capable of appearing normal and trustworthy. He would be articulate enough to gain victims' trust, disciplined enough to avoid capture, and knowledgeable enough to understand police procedures. This profile was remarkably accurate, but it also described hundreds of thousands of men in the region. The investigation employed increasingly sophisticated surveillance techniques. Undercover officers, many of them young policewomen acting as decoys, worked railway stations and bus stops. The goal was to identify suspicious individuals approaching vulnerable people. This was dangerous work. The decoys were putting themselves at risk to draw out a killer known for extreme violence. During this period, Chikatilo came under suspicion multiple times. In 1985, he was again questioned when found behaving suspiciously near a crime scene area. But once again, he was released. The blood type evidence still didn't match. His party membership still provided a protective shield. His explanations, traveling for work, waiting for trains, still seemed plausible. The turning point came in 1988 when a forensic scientist named Viktor Kolyesnikov made a crucial discovery while reviewing old evidence. Kolyesnikov noticed the discrepancy in Chikatilo's biological samples and recognized what it meant. The suspect was a non-secretor, someone whose blood type and bodily fluids differs from their actual blood type. This phenomenon was rare and poorly understood in Soviet forensics, but Kolyesnikov's insight changed everything. Suddenly, the evidence that had repeatedly cleared Chikatilo now pointed directly at him. The blood type that had been his greatest protection was revealed as the ultimate proof of his guilt. Investigators went back through their files with new understanding, and Chikatilo's name emerged as a stronger suspect than ever before. But by this time, Chikatilo had stopped killing, or at least, slowed dramatically. The massive police presence had made him cautious. Between 1986 and 1990, the frequency of murders dropped significantly. Some investigators feared he had died, moved away, or been imprisoned for other crimes. The trail had gone cold. Then, in 1990, Chikatilo resumed his killing spree. The long gap had perhaps given him a false sense of security, or maybe his compulsions had simply become too strong to resist. On January 14, 1990, he murdered a young man. In August, he killed a boy in Rostov. In October, 2 more victims. And in November 1990, he would claim what would be his final victim. The resumption of murders galvanized the investigation. Surveillance was intensified at railway stations in the Rostov region. Plainclothes officers monitored stations around the clock, looking for anyone matching the profile Burakov had developed. The police were searching for a middle-aged man, probably educated, who traveled frequently by train and showed interest in young people. On November 6, 1990, Chikatilo killed his last victim, a young boy named Vadim Gromov, in the woods near Leskov station. It was a murder of shocking brutality, even by Chikatilo's standards. The boy's mutilated body was discovered soon after, and investigators knew immediately that their killer had struck again. What Chikatilo didn't know was that he had been seen. An undercover police officer named Igor Rybakov had noticed a middle-aged man emerging from the woods near where the body would soon be found. The man's hands and face had what appeared to be blood on them, which he was attempting to wash off at a public water pump. Rybakov noted his description and behavior but didn't arrest him immediately. The man might have a legitimate explanation for his appearance. The man was checked at the station as he departed. His name was recorded, Andrei Chikatilo. When this information was cross-referenced with investigation files, bells began ringing throughout the investigation hierarchy. Chikatilo was already a suspect. He had been questioned before. His work travel matched the geographic pattern of murders. And now, most damning of all, they understood the blood type evidence. The investigators knew they had their man. But they needed to be certain. They began intensive surveillance of Chikatilo, watching his every move, documenting his travels, building an airtight case. For 2 weeks, teams of investigators followed him, waiting for the right moment to make their arrest. On November 20, 1990, 12 years after his first murder, Andrei Chikatilo was arrested as he walked on a street in Novocherkassk. The investigation that had consumed enormous resources, involved hundreds of investigators, and lasted over a decade was finally approaching its conclusion. The Red Ripper was in custody. When Andrei Chikatilo was arrested on November 20, 1990, investigators were confident they had their killer, but they still needed proof that would stand up in court. What followed was one of the most extraordinary confessions in criminal history, a detailed admission of depravity that exceeded even investigators' worst expectations. Initially, Chikatilo denied everything. For days, he maintained his innocence, insisting he was a respectable Soviet citizen, a family man who couldn't possibly have committed such crimes. But the investigators were patient. They presented evidence piece by piece: his presence at crime scenes, his travel patterns that matched the murders, witness accounts, and finally, the damning blood type evidence that now made sense. The breakthrough came when psychiatrist Alexander Buchanovsky was brought in to assist with the interrogation. Buchanovsky had created a psychological profile of the killer years earlier, and his insights proved crucial. Rather than aggressive interrogation, Buchanovsky approached Chikatilo with understanding, treating him as a patient rather than simply a criminal. This approach, combined with mounting evidence, finally broke through Chikatilo's defenses. On November 30, 1990, Chikatilo began to confess. And once he started, the flood of admissions was overwhelming. He confessed not to the 36 murders investigators had connected to him, but to 56 killings spanning 12 years. He provided details only the killer could know: locations of undiscovered bodies, specific mutilations he had performed, items he had taken from victims. But what shocked investigators most was Chikatilo's apparent lack of remorse. He described his crimes in clinical detail, explaining his methods, his selection of victims, how he had evaded police. He spoke of his murders almost academically, as if discussing someone else's actions. There was no emotion, no guilt, no recognition of the humanity of his victims. He led investigators to several bodies that had never been found, proving the truth of his confessions. However, he also confessed to 3 murders that investigators determined he couldn't have committed. Either he was lying for attention, or his memory had distorted reality after so many killings. The final confirmed count was 52 murders. The details of what Chikatilo had done to his victims were so horrific that portions of his confession were never made public. He described how he would stab victims dozens of times while sexually assaulting them, how the act of violence itself was what provided him sexual release. He admitted to acts of cannibalism, to mutilating bodies in increasingly grotesque ways, to targeting the eyes of his victims, which he believed watched him during his attacks. Perhaps most chilling was how ordinary he appeared. This wasn't a crazed maniac foaming at the mouth. This was a mundane man, balding, wearing glasses, soft-spoken. In photographs and video from his confession, he appears like anyone's grandfather, not one of history's most prolific serial killers. The banality of his evil was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. Chikatilo's trial began on April 14, 1992, in Rostov. The proceedings would last 6 months and become a media sensation, one of the first major Soviet trials to receive extensive press coverage. By this time, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the new Russian Federation was more open with information. For the first time, the Russian public learned the full scope of what had been happening in their midst. The trial was a spectacle of horror. Chikatilo was kept in an iron cage in the courtroom, ostensibly for his protection from victims' families, but also symbolic of his status as a caged animal. Relatives of victims crowded the courtroom, many weeping as evidence was presented. The details revealed in court were so disturbing that some spectators had to leave. Chikatilo's behavior during the trial was bizarre and theatrical. He alternated between calm, detailed testimony and wild outbursts. He exposed himself in court, shouted nonsensical statements, pulled down his pants, and claimed he was radiating energy. At times he appeared coherent and intelligent, at others, completely deranged. His lawyers attempted an insanity defense, but psychiatric evaluations concluded he was legally sane and understood his actions. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented evidence linking Chikatilo to 53 of the murders, one more than he confessed to. The evidence included his detailed confessions matching unpublicized crime scene details, the blood type evidence, now properly understood, witness testimony placing him with victims before they disappeared, items recovered from his home matching possessions taken from victims, his inability to provide alibis for the times of the murders, the geographic and temporal correlation between his work travel and the killings. Chikatilo's defense was pathetic. His lawyers argued insanity, claiming his traumatic childhood and sexual dysfunction had rendered him incapable of controlling his actions. They painted him as a victim of his own psychological damage. But the court rejected this argument. Chikatilo had held down jobs, maintained a family, successfully evaded police for years, all evidence of someone who understood right from wrong and could control his behavior. On October 15, 1992, Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 murders and sentenced to death for each count. The judge's reading of the verdict took nearly an hour, each murder detailed, each victim named. When it was over, Chikatilo's only response was a strange rambling speech in which he blamed his crimes on society, on his childhood, on everything except himself. On February 14, 1994, Valentine's Day, cruelly enough, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head in a soundproofed room in Novocherkassk prison. He was 57 years old. His last words were reportedly a plea for forgiveness, though accounts vary. The execution was carried out in secret. His family learned of his death only afterward. There was no funeral, no grave marker. His body was cremated, his ashes disposed of without ceremony. The Red Ripper was erased from the physical world, though his crimes would never be forgotten. But Chikatilo's death was not the end of the story. The case left behind questions, victims, and lessons that continue to resonate decades later. The investigation exposed deep flaws in Soviet law enforcement and highlighted how ideological blindness and bureaucratic dysfunction could cost lives. In many ways, the system itself had been on trial alongside Chikatilo. The human cost was staggering. 52 confirmed victims, children, teenagers, young women, their lives brutally cut short. Each had a family, friends, futures that would never be realized. Some victims were never identified, buried in anonymous graves. Others were runaways, orphans, or troubled youth, society's most vulnerable, whose disappearances were barely noticed until it was too late. For the victims' families, the pain continues. Many struggled with the horror of what happened to their loved ones, with the knowledge of how they suffered in their final moments. Some families never received closure. Their relatives' bodies were never found or were so badly mutilated they couldn't be properly identified. The psychological trauma rippled outward, affecting entire communities. The case also left behind victims who survived Chikatilo in different ways. Alexander Kravchenko, executed in 1983 for Chikatilo's first murder, was posthumously exonerated, but that was cold comfort to his family. Several other men had been wrongfully imprisoned or executed for crimes Chikatilo committed. These miscarriages of justice highlighted the dangers of police torture, false confessions, and the pressure to solve cases quickly at any cost. For investigators like Mikhail Fedosov and Viktor Burakov, the case was both their greatest triumph and a source of lasting trauma. They had finally caught the killer, but not before he had claimed dozens of lives. They lived with the knowledge that if the investigation had been better coordinated, if the blood type evidence had been correctly understood sooner, if the Soviet system hadn't been so dysfunctional, many lives might have been saved. The case forced changes in Soviet and later Russian law enforcement. It demonstrated the need for better information sharing between jurisdictions, the importance of forensic science, and the value of psychological profiling. The investigation pioneered techniques that would become standard in Russian criminal investigations. It also led to more openness about criminal cases. The old Soviet practice of hiding such crimes from the public was recognized as dangerous. But perhaps most importantly, the Chikatilo case shattered myths about serial killers and where they could exist. The Soviet Union's ideological insistence that serial murder was a Western phenomenon had delayed the investigation and cost lives. The case proved that monsters could emerge anywhere, regardless of political system or ideology. Evil was not a product of capitalism or socialism, it was a human capacity that existed everywhere. The case has been extensively studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals worldwide. It appears in textbooks on criminal psychology, serial murder, and forensic investigation. It has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films. The details of Chikatilo's crimes and his psychology continue to provide insights into the darkest aspects of human nature. What lessons can we draw from this horror? First, that vigilance is essential. The signs were there: Chikatilo's inappropriate behavior with children, his presence at multiple crime scenes, his suspicious activities. But those signs were ignored or explained away because people didn't want to see them, because he didn't fit the expected profile, because acknowledging the truth was uncomfortable. Second, that systems and institutions must prioritize truth over ideology or appearances. The Soviet system's denial that serial killers could exist in their society cost lives. When institutions refuse to acknowledge uncomfortable realities, when they prioritize image over substance, people suffer. Third, that the most dangerous people often hide in plain sight. Chikatilo wasn't a monster lurking in the shadows. He was a teacher, a party member, a husband and father. He wore the mask of normalcy while committing atrocities. This is perhaps the most unsettling lesson. Evil doesn't always look like we expect it to. Finally, the case reminds us of the importance of protecting the vulnerable. Chikatilo's victims were largely children, runaways, and troubled youth, people on the margins of society whose disappearances weren't immediately investigated with urgency. Today, the forests and railway stations where Chikatilo hunted are quiet. New generations have grown up with no memory of the terror that gripped the region in the 1980s. But the victims are not forgotten. Memorials have been erected in some locations. Families still mourn. And the case remains a stark reminder of what can happen when evil is allowed to flourish unchecked. The story of Andrei Chikatilo, the Red Ripper, the Butcher of Rostov, is not just about one man's monstrous crimes. It's about systemic failure, ideological blindness, and the terrible cost of denial. It's about the vulnerable victims who paid the ultimate price for society's failures. And it's about the investigators who finally, after 12 long years, brought a monster to justice. But perhaps most of all, it's a warning. A reminder that monsters exist, that they can hide behind masks of respectability, and that eternal vigilance is the price of protecting the innocent. The story of the Red Ripper is one that must never be forgotten, because the lessons it teaches are too important to ignore. The bodies have been buried. The killer has been executed. But the echoes of those 12 years of terror remain, a dark chapter in criminal history that continues to resonate. And somewhere in that darkness, there is a lesson about human nature, about systems and societies, about good and evil, that we must never stop trying to understand. This has been the story of Andrei Chikatilo, one of history's most prolific serial killers, and a reminder that the greatest horrors often emerge not from the shadows we fear, but from the ordinary faces we trust. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and share.